Auto sequence start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So I guess the first place to start is welcome everybody. You know, it's fantastic to welcome everybody to this sort of higher education specific masterclass that we're going to focus on today. The title of the session is Crafting the Perfect Higher Education Paid Advertising Strategy to Fuel Student Acquisition. I think from my perspective, I want this to be a relatively interactive sort of session. I think Ben and I, absolutely welcome sort of input from others on this. So I think that as we go through, if you've got any questions, queries that you'd like to pick up with us, then absolutely do let us know as we go through this. So I guess the first place to start from our side is introductions. My name's David Norris. I'm the Performance Marketing Director here at Mediaworks. That means I'm ultimately responsible for all of our performance or pure performance-based channels. That means paid search, paid social, and video, shopping, affiliates, and also programmatic and display. Ben, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, morning everyone. My name is Ben Holmer. I'm the head of page strategy at Mediaworks. My role is to really define full paid multi-channel strategies for a lot of our clients. I've done quite a bit of work in education in the past or working with education-based clients, anything from actual management or big consultancy projects as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why sort of it's worth saying that Ben and I both have a passion in this space. Ben's worked on numerous sort of clients across this sector, across numerous channels, etc. Prior to joining Mediaworks, I was actually an associate dean / deputy dean at various business schools in the UK with over 10 years worth of experience in higher education. So this really is an enormous area for us here at Mediaworks and a focus of what we do. So really what we want to do is we want to share some of that insight and our views and give you practical tips and tricks that you can take away and challenge your current strategies or put into practice when considering new strategies that you're devising. So when it comes to Mediaworks, we know that it's a complex digital landscape out there working with multiple clients. We know this. At the center of everything that we do is performance. I always say we're a performance-based agency. Our focus is absolutely on performance. For our clients, ultimately, we know if we're not performing and we're not delivering results for clients, then it doesn't work in the best interest of the client. It definitely doesn't work in the best interest of Mediaworks. So we know that there's that real strong sense of sort of customer focus and ensuring that we drive in performance. We anchor everything that we do around performance around 4 key areas, really. That's data. So the explosion of accessible data this day and age, particularly from a paid perspective, I have to say, it really is what drives everything that we do. All the decisions that we make are data-driven, and we use the data in real time to make those sort of real-time decisions to optimize and ensure that it's effective as possible. We then also have a focus on technology. So we always use the latest technology, and that can be in platform. It can actually be technology that we devise ourselves. But the reality is we want to ensure that we use the technology the best of its ability. And that can be things like automation. It can be, new platforms, new channels, etc., that we explore and work with our clients on. But we're always sort of leading edge from a technology perspective. Creativity. Frankly, without creativity, it doesn't matter really what we do in terms of delivery. It won't resonate, it won't engage, it won't get the cut through that you need to achieve this day and age. We know that the digital space has got more competitive across every single industry that we work in. That's been sort of heightened and driven really by the changes that we've seen by the pandemic. So it's really important that we are always thinking of creativity, not just at a campaign level, but also at a strategic level. So a big part of what Ben does across the paid team is come up with those creative strategies. It's not just about clients saying to us, I want to run a paid social campaign or I want to run a paid search campaign. A big part of what Ben does for us here at Mediaworks is he really focuses on creative solutions to allow a client to achieve their objectives. And that can be, as Ben highlighted at the beginning, multi-channel, multi-segment, multi-industry. It's all about achieving results. And then finally, strategy. What we typically don't do is we typically aren't a reactive campaign type of agency. We're not somebody that likes to work with people on a one-off basis we've got a month's budget, can you do this for us? Even when we do that, it is not we don't focus on tactics. We have to understand the strategy, and then the tactics are derived from the strategy. So we always focus on being commercial first and delivering the results that people would like to achieve. So I guess it's worth saying our previous missions. So I think from my perspective, so when I see this, what I've put on screen are just some of the big clients that we work with. We work with a string of clients across industry, across geography, actually. I think it's fair to say that something Ben and I have been working on this morning. We've been talking about whether Portuguese and Spanish translations are the same in Europe versus the same in South America, and do they have subtle differences, etc. So that gives you a flavour for the things that we work on. It's not just UK focused. It is an international focus. And it's not just sort of smaller brands. It's not a specific sector. We work cross-sector. What you'll notice about the slide that you see on screen right now is that what we're not focusing on here is higher education. But it's worth saying that, we are probably working with, I believe, sort of 6 clients from a paid perspective right now in the higher education space. And that's running everything from apprenticeship-specific campaigns or focusing on apprenticeships to really full-service sort of cross-university activities. So that might be full recruitment campaigns for a whole institute, and that might be across a number of channels, not just paid. So we're working on, specific areas, but also, that more general piece. So, hopefully, again, we can share some of the insight that we've taken from other industries as well into higher education. So, what is the state of higher education right now? I think it's fair to say, having left higher education just a little under 18 months ago, that the state of higher education is that it's a constantly evolving landscape. It's moving all of the time. And I think what we've done here is we've pulled out a few sort of key statistics that we're aware of. So UCAS applications is sort of the bread and butter for most universities out there. And from a recruitment perspective, we know that nationally, as of yesterday when we were looking in the UCAS portal, that 6.5% increase in UCAS applications right now are taking place year on year. And that's fueled by a number of factors. Primarily clearing. We're seeing 70,000 students were accepted through clearing last year. We know that clearing's is here to stay. Clearing used to be, up till when the market opened up about 5 or 6 years ago, or 7 years ago now in 2014, that clearing was traditional clearing. Now clearing is seen as a route to study. It's not just seen as you didn't get your grades, so now you're looking for a new place at a new institution. And we know that we approximately saw 20,000 people apply in clearing last year who never applied at any point earlier than that. So it's actually seen as more of a late application stage as much as it is a clearing opportunity now. We also know that 25,000 courses were actually in the clearing process last year, which is an incredible statistic, and just shows that for those courses that run that don't have hard caps on them and don't have sort of hard conversion numbers to achieve on them, that are open recruiting courses, I would say. We know that clearing is going to play an ever important role in this process. We also know that the pandemic is playing into this somewhat, with people unable to understand sort of what the future is going to look like, what their other opportunities may be, whether that be apprenticeships, whether that be direct into employment when traditionally leaving college, etc. So there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of holding patterns that we're seeing right now in the marketplace. From both students but also institutions. I was reading statistics that said universities are actually sort of going firm on less students this year in terms of the places that they're offering, and that's driven by predicted grades, etc., etc. But it's fascinating to see how that's going to play out with, what I would regard is a really heavy sort of period coming up in terms of intense over the next 6 weeks to 6 to 12 weeks leading into the term starting at the end of September for most institutions. I think it's also worth saying that demographic that we saw, up until I think last year, it was when sort of demographics were not in favour of higher education providers who typically, predominantly focus on 18-year-old, learners from further education providers. So, what we'd seen is a demographic decrease. So there was arguably less 18-year-olds entering the market year on year. And that was a trend that had taken place for, I think, about 6 or 7 years. So what we're now seeing is it's bottomed out, and we're now seeing that upswing. So this is predictive, by the way. This is, demographics are a fact based of the UK. So we know that there was more babies born in 2003, 2004, 2005 that are now going to be producing 18-year-olds over the next sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That ultimately that upswing starting to take place. So there's actually more 18-year-olds in the marketplace than there was last year. And from a digital perspective, a bit of digital insight is there's actually 21% year-on-year increase in impressions in Q2 in 2021. So what we know is that the marketplace has got more competitive. We know that there's more people searching for these terms. We know that there is more essentially competition around people searching for higher education and higher education related courses. And that's a statistic that we've seen from Google. So I think it's also worth saying at this point, it's where I always say it was one of the things I always found fascinating about working in higher education, because I'm speaking to the converted, no doubt, in this sort of masterclass that we're delivering is people have a perception from outside of people who don't work in higher education or work with higher education that it's very much this sort of transactional model, if you like, of learners enter the market, i.e. looking for where they're going to study, typically the end of the first year of further education course, that then they put applications together and start applying to universities between sort of October and January. They then sort of get more serious about where they're going to go and study and having a look around through things like open days, virtual open days, speaking to tutors, reviewing sort of credentials on various platforms, comparing courses, etc. in that consideration piece. Then there's that intent where they actually apply for the course in typically January. And then what we're trying to do is we're trying to influence that decision right through until they make the final decision, arguably in May, but ultimately in sort of that August piece when they get the results. I think that what we've seen in pretty much every industry in higher education is no different, is that that's moved. That model has absolutely shifted. And it's not necessarily that linear model that we see. It's actually more complicated. Yes, there's that linear element, but now what we see is that the representation on screen with all the squiggles that you see is probably more accurate in the sense that it's not a linear process. We're going to show you some statistics later on around how many people convert on first point of entry. It's hardly anybody. The reality is that especially with complex decision-making processes, there's significant amount of touch points along the way. And that complexity means that it's not just that simple linear model anymore. We still do use the linear model in a sense that we understand that there's this awareness, consideration, intent, decision, and advocacy. But the way that Ben and I have described it to clients previously is it's more like snakes and ladders than it is a funnel now. You can be, people can move from awareness to intent pretty quickly and then actually move back and then go into the consideration process because they reconsider their options or they're looking at sort of different processes, etc. So we're going to talk a little about that and how we manage that in the complexity of higher education. So from a marketing perspective, Ben, I think it's worth saying that Mediaworks are a full-service digital agency. Today, we're going to focus on paid. What I would say is that we focus on paid advertising, but there is things like SEO, PR, reputation, and reputation management, media planning and buy-in, and then content sits very much at the heart of a lot of what we do. But we're going to focus on paid today, and we're going to talk about some of those tactical things that you can do, because I know that we've already had a question which I'll address around clearing and how you influence clearing and what the process is around that, but also thinking about short-term campaigns, but also thinking about long-term campaigns, thinking about what you should be doing to influence recruitment in September 2022, which, for me, that planning should be taking place right now. But also we understand that in higher education, just like in any other industry, there also needs to be that responsiveness, and the industry has moved on significantly. The statistic there that you see from Google is fascinating to me in the sense that when they monitor customer journeys, they recognise that online consumer touchpoints range between 20 to 500 depending on purchase. Higher education actually sits at the upper end of that scale, primarily because it's quite a complex decision that people go through. It's quite an elongated decision-making process and generally quite a high value intent purchase, if you like, in terms of what learners are looking to do at that time. Most university costs in the UK, undergraduate recruitment is set at 9,250 for most courses per year, £27,000 plus accommodation. You can see how a student is making a decision that is potentially going to cost them sort of anywhere between £40,000 and £50,000 over that 3-year period. So this is in most learners' decision-making process, this is the most significant decision that they've made up until that stage at the life they're currently at. So, they are going to sort of have numerous customer touch points and are going to sort of search for that data. And then when we wanted to map out sort of brand touch points, I just wanted to sort of highlight a typical ecosystem. And Ben, do you want to sort of come in on the left-hand side of the screen, and then I'll talk about the right-hand side of the screen here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, whenever we're trying to create awareness of a brand or a product or anything like that, there are different tactics that we kind of need to put in place. And this is where my role really comes into play, because there are specific channels which will work at, they will work better at specific points of the user journey. But it's definitely not something that you just discount straight away if it's not, let's take search, for example. You might look at search and think that's intent-based, people are actually looking for this. So that only really is relevant towards the bottom end of the funnel or the latter stage of that journey, where in reality, it's not. There's a lot of tactics that you can put in place for search, whether you go for, real kind of top of funnel generic terms or something like that, which allows search to be that part of that full journey. So it may be touch point 1, it may also be touch point 2 all the way to 100. It may factor in every single one of those touch points. And that's something to really consider when building out these strategies, is that all of these touch points are valuable at every stage, but it's really about mapping out what you want to get out of that process and kind of configuring where those channels are going to sit in that user journey and where they're going to be more relevant. So you'll find things such as paid social, influencers, offline, out of home, all these kind of different channels are there to build awareness, but they also can play a bigger part the further down the user journey that someone moves.
Yeah, and I think then that sort of leads us nicely into this world here, Ben, that changed significantly. I'm thinking last year and through this recruitment cycle for most institutions as to whether you've been running open days, virtual open days, etc. I appreciate that the old model, and I've stood at my fair share of open days myself and sort of delivered talks at man stands and gone to UCAS fairs and various other things. So there used to be that physical presence element. It used to be very much at that awareness stage. It was right, let's try and drive people into these, ecosystems, if you like, of a university or recruitment fair where you could interact with somebody on a one-to-one basis. I think what we've seen is a significant sort of shift because people can't necessarily come on the campus or are more reluctant to travel, etc. So that web presence, particularly, as I say, over the last 12 months, since the new norm kicked in, it moved to web content. It was about how you can showcase university. I mean, we've worked with providers who have gone to virtual open days, who were trying to sort of create a mirror image of what an open day would be through an online presence. Letting people speak to tutors on a one-to-one basis, letting people speak to student ambassadors, etc., through online channels. So it's not just about a physical presence anymore, and it's not just about a web presence. It's about sort of how you mirror those up in the role that they both play. Then we've got the onboarding element. So how do you actually then onboard somebody through this process as well? And we need to obviously think about that. Having worked in, say, higher education for a number of years, I know that onboarding is a really important element, letting learners know that they feel part of it and part of the journey and part of what they're going to do and how they're going to engage with you. And I'm not just talking about onboarding in terms of enrollment. I'm talking about onboarding towards these events. onboarding towards sort of making someone firm, onboarding to make sure that somebody's choosing your institution above another or your course above another. So we need to understand that. And part of that is being around sort of bots, apps, web, and that's things like support. We've talked about closed Facebook groups here. We've seen some really good examples of universities really adapting in this space. So, putting all of the people that have applied to their course in specific courses into a closed Facebook group where they can interact with student ambassadors from the current learners on the course, or whether they're speaking to sort of the tutors, or whether they're speaking to general student advisors or career advisors, etc. There's a lot of brand touch points along the way, and it's so important that there's that sort of harmony and there's that structure and there's that consistency and clarity between each of these areas. So I now want to talk about campaigns. So what we've got in each of these areas is we've got some key statistics that we wanted to share with you around sort of the paid channels. And Ben and I are going to talk about how we think we can actually sort of use these to best intent. So I think from our perspective, it's sort of content is absolutely key in terms of what you do. So what we've got here is, this is actually a model that Google talk about. They'll talk about A plus B plus C equals divide by V. And that'll talk about, how your creativity is going to hit home. And what we'll talk about is achieving that cut through. So A stands for abnormal. Is there something unusual and outstanding about the creative? Will it catch people's attention? We see a lot of creative for universities out there that frankly just feels like same old, same old. It feels like it's not grabbing your attention. It's not really selling any of the USPs of your institution, and whether that be a social video, whether that be in the ad copy you're actually using in your paid search ads, Ben. I think for us, it's about, again, how do you stand out? How do you achieve cut through in already competitive space? B, does it highlight the benefit? So we're all after, can that solve the problem that I've came here looking for, or can that solve the channels that we're looking at? So, it's about clearly articulating sort of the benefits that are out there and the benefits that your institution can deliver above other institutions, or at course level, what can your course deliver that other courses can't? C equals culture. So what we've seen in particular recently is things like cultural reference points will resonate with a target audience. Be talking to them in their language or in a way that will talk about things that will hit home and talk to them, rather than just feeling like it's sort of the same old, same old. And I think for me, it's about, being culturally relevant. So ensuring that you're on trend, ensuring that you're, being focused on and communicating in a way that resonates with your audience. And then finally, V, and I think this is what we call vampire. You have to watch out for the vampire. So vampires are anything that will jar. So that can be bad music, bad acting in the videos that you're producing, cheesy stock photography, poor quality production. It doesn't hit home. And the reality is, I keep talking about it, in a competitive landscape, if you're not able to sort of avoid those pitfalls, and people are just going to not engage with you. They have got options. Learners have got options. We know that. They've probably got more options now than they've ever had. So it's about ensuring that you avoid these pitfalls and challenges along the way. Finally, the other point that I wanted to make on this slide was around personalization. Personalization in digital has become the accepted norm. When we used to do personalization 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was the exception. Now it's absolutely the norm. So, people expect to see tailored content that meets their needs. They don't expect to see advertising that's generic, a one-size-fits-all model. They expect to be spoken to in a way that appeals directly to them. And that goes through anything like emails, the advertising that you're putting forward, the long-tail solutions from a paid search perspective, Ben, that really, resonate and hit home rather than that sort of generic piece. But we know that consumers are more likely to engage, purchase, sort of on board with brands that provide personalization, because it's that sense of belonging. We still know that for most learners, that sense of belonging is the thing that they're looking for. And it's why sort of open days, etc., won't go away. They'll just be, move forward and slightly be more dynamic. So I guess we're at a point now, Ben, where I'd like to take a bit of stock. So And I'm going to answer a few of the questions that have came in, because we're now at the point where sort of we're going to talk about channel choices, and without going into each channel specifically, which is what we'll do in a few slides' time, I want to talk about some of the questions that we've got in. So as you can see, we've got lots of channel choices here. I think it's fair to say you've got, a myriad of choices, and often the thing is, what to do, and often the point of strategy is actually deciding what not to do, because we see a lot of institutions that want to do everything, and actually the budgets don't allow them to do everything. So it's about where you're going to get, best impact, biggest bang for your buck. So as I said, we appreciate that it's not a linear model, but we're going to talk you through sort of where to fit in the funnel. So would it be an awareness piece, consideration, intent, decision, advocacy? So I'm going to come in on the first point, which is what is the most common mistake people make during their paid clearing campaigns? Ben, would you like to come in on that?
Yes. So there's a few, to be honest, but I think the most common one, and the way I can try and relate this to another industry, is clearing to us as advertisers is very much like Black Friday. And the biggest kind of mistake that people make is just lack of preparation. We've worked with industries in the past, or educational industries in the past, where we kind of, we push for a brief. We want to prep for clearing as in advance as we possibly can. So, we might be looking at this 2, 3, 4 months in advance of clearing. But, a common pitfall is 2 days before clearing, what are we going to do? We want to run X, Y, and Z, which, sometimes you do have to be reactive, but really that lack of preparation, kind of sets you back in a industry really where it is insanely competitive, and it's only going to become more and more competitive. These industries are becoming more savvy, and they're working with agencies who are also becoming more savvy. So these plans are being put in place months in advance, and they're ready and raring to go. And if you're kind of running around last minute trying to get things in place, it just opens up a lot of opportunity for simple mistakes to be made. Potential of not really strategizing the channels correctly. Something as simple as that makes a huge difference when it comes to clearing. So I think really for me, it might be a simple one, but preparation is just essential when it comes to this thing. Like I say, it's like Black Friday. If a retailer comes to us, one of our clients, the day before Black Friday, there's not a lot of time to turn that round and run promotions and all this kind of thing. There's time for approvals that are needed. And these kind of things are needed with Google regardless. There are approval times, and around these kind of really busy times like clearing, there are delays. And because clearing is such a small time frame, it runs for a very small amount of time. The last thing that you want is any kind of delays with approvals. You want everything done and dusted, ready to just be switched on the day, and you're all good to go.
Yeah, and I think an example of that, Ben, I'd say as well, is one of the common pitfalls I've seen, and as I say, working in the sector for a number of years, is that last minute sort of call that you can get from your chief finance officer that we numbers aren't where they need to be, or we want to push on these particular courses, so we're now making this additional money available, and they're telling you that on sort of 2 days before actual sort of the results day on August the 15th. I think the problem there is you can't actually spend that money effectively sometimes. The reality is you'd have been better spending that money sort of further in advance or at a different time period, because each platform has learning periods. Social, as an example, social is going to take you X amount of traffic to actually learn, and then putting more money and just giving the system a jolt actually can throw off your campaigns. It can throw off the learning that's taking place. It can actually sort of mean that you're not running an optimized campaign, even though you might think having more money is the answer. If you do it in a really reactive way, it can actually throw your campaigns from an optimization perspective, because it means that you can't get the traffic through. So then you're optimizing towards broader audience, and it means that you're then trying to convert people who you wouldn't naturally convert, or people who are at a different point in the funnel or in the stage of the decision-making process. So the biggest mistake, I would absolutely agree with Ben, is around sort of that lack of preparation. And the second piece I would say that goes hand in hand is around not understanding what you're trying to achieve. I think that we see a lot of that in clearing. I think as I've said, clearing used to be that panic stations. I remember, I won't say how many years ago now, but I remember sort of getting my results and seeing people as an A-level student, and then seeing the way that people responded to clearing and the panic that set in. The reality is, I think we still see a bit of that panic replicated, not just from students, but also institutions. And then they become really confused about, well, who is their audience and who are they trying to speak to and how are they going to speak to them? Because, instead of necessarily understanding them from a funnel perspective, it can become very sort of bottom of the funnel. It's just about, right, let's go really hard on these terms and really pick them up. But actually, it's about still that understanding that people are hitting clearing and they're actually now, a lot of institutions are going to be hitting people with messages roundabout now that don't worry if you don't get the grades that you were predicted, or don't worry if you haven't got what you want, or don't worry if you're thinking about going to, the career that you were looking for hasn't materialised. There's still space at our institution. So then the idea that people are going to be making panic decisions when it comes to August 15th is probably lessened because they've had those softened messages throughout. So I think that for me, it's about understanding that clearing just isn't about one day. It's actually, for me, clearing's about an elongated period. It's about, what happens from now, if you like, right through to, the end of September, when a lot of institutions will still be accepting and recruiting students. It's about how you can actually get the most out of that. So I hope, anonymous attendee, we answered your question there around some of the common mistakes we see during paid clearing campaigns. But thank you very much for that question. Second question is, would you recommend an always-on paid campaign? And could you break down an example of how that would look across social and search? Ben, I think it's always worth saying, what is an always-on campaign?
So always on is, well, it could be defined in a few different ways, but it's exactly what it says on the tin, really. It's a campaign that runs continuously throughout the year. And generally, an example of this could be a brand campaign. Brand is something that should always be considered. There's a few debates about where and when you should use brand campaigns, but that's an example of an always on campaign. Now, when it comes to would we recommend them, I think simply the answer is yes. And there's two perspectives to look at from this. The first is a technical one, where if you are using things like Google or Facebook or Bing or all these different kind of platforms, then quite simply, if you pause campaigns or if you turn campaigns off and you don't run for a specific period of time, those campaigns cannot learn. They can only learn when they're active and they're in the marketplace. And, when it comes to, if we take Google and we look at search, for example, then, campaigns run, they make learnings, and you improve things such as quality score. Google always relies on data to power everything that you do. If you're a brand new institution, for example, and you decide you want to go and run some paid search advertising, Google don't know you, they don't trust you, and they have to build that trust factor. Anytime that you turn a campaign off, or if all of your campaigns are turned off, there's no relationship building there. So Google will instantly drop their trust rating in you, which means that things like cost per clicks will go up. And when it comes to peak times in the year, like clearing, for example, you could end up paying a considerable amount more for the same amount of traffic if you just kept your campaigns running throughout the year. So yes, I actually think that always on campaigns are something that should definitely be considered in education. When we have a look at examples of how this may work between search and social, search we kind of touched on brand might be an opportunity there. Something that we've certainly found working with educational clients is that there are peaks and troughs throughout the year of when students or potential students may look for the next stage in their, in the next stage in their career or educational journey. But they're always there. They're always going to be looking for it. Just because I might not look for that at a specific time doesn't mean that there aren't, 1,000 other people who are looking for it at a specific time. People are different. We all react differently online, and we all have different user habits. So taking into account that regardless of when you do advertise, there is going to be someone there searching for a product that you sell. It's just about being there for them at that time. Now, when it comes to social, we can be a lot more savvy. We can be a lot more creative. And the main role, if you're looking for an always-on campaign, in my opinion, from social, would be that big brand awareness piece. Especially if we're looking for users, let's say a year in advance, how do we put our brand name in front of those users? And we want to do that in a really clever way. We don't want to ram brand names down the throat and make sure that we're advertising to them 15 times a day, every day for a full year, because quite simply, that's overkill. And we need to do it in a, kind of a softer, gentle way. Once those users then start to interact with you and your website, we can be a little bit more aggressive. We can change up those bits of content that we're pushing in front of those users. And that's where we really move from awareness into that remarketing stage. We still might not be focused on converting those users, but it's about drip feeding them content that's relevant and building a relationship with the user who isn't really a student yet. We want to get them to that point. So it's about really being there for the user at the right point in time. And we kind of touched on it before, and David mentioned it. This is where content becomes crucial. We need to make sure the right messaging is in front of the right person at the right time. And we aren't overkill. We aren't going all in all the time, because, in an online world where advertising is everywhere, it can become a bit unbearable for a user. And when it becomes unbearable, it's very, very difficult to try and rebuild that relationship. So yeah, it's all about having the right content at the right time, at the right point for the user. That might sound quite simple, but it can be quite complicated to make sure that you get that one right.
Yeah, I think just to come on the social piece, Ben, I think AlwaysOn for me would be around sort of identifying the key audiences. And I think one of the things I would say is most institutions that I've ever worked with or worked for have been really heavy on data. You've got some fantastic data that you'll get from, whether that be through UCAS or whether that be through your international admissions office, or whether that be, for your postgraduate courses, in terms of, the great thing about universities is you're awash with applicant data. So you can, break down where do those audiences come from? What was the demographics of them? What geographical location did they come through? Which people, and then you can start to really break down sort of what are the channels that demographic engage with. I think from social prospecting, 100%, I would always be running an AlwaysOn campaign from a prospecting perspective on social. The other thing I'd say is it's relatively cheap to do so. It's really cheap to get those impressions and that exposure from a prospecting perspective on social. And I think it's a bit like what you said, Ben. You're then able to capture a number of people at that awareness stage that you can then drag into other areas of your campaigns that you can run remarketing to at peak points throughout the year. So from my perspective, an AlwaysOn campaign, focusing on prospecting from a social perspective would be absolutely where I'd go. I think, although this hasn't been asked in the question, I think also programmatic, which I know we'll talk about, and display also play a big part in that as well. I would, be looking at an AlwaysOn campaign, again, from a prospecting perspective across those channels, but we'll touch on that in a few slides' time.
I think it's worth also adding, David, on the social piece, the way that we can be really creative is there's the opportunity to advertise based on life events. So, whether it's graduations and, depending on which location you're targeting here, these life events do differ. But that's how you can really be creative and clever with your messaging. Something that's relevant to the user might seem, in some cases, a user might look at that and go, oh, that's a bit weird. How does someone know that? But it's relevant to the user. And it might be the flip side of that, where they think, actually, that's really relevant for me right now. And they process that a lot quicker. And we can just be creative. And that's the real opportunity that we have with social.
Yeah, massively. And I think that flows nicely, Ben, into the question that we've also got, which is around, is it worth doing A/B testing on content for different audiences during clearing? I think Ben sort of alluded to this. Content's massive. Content's absolutely key. Ben's highlighted why content matters from a quality score perspective, from a search perspective. But we also know that content, has a massive impact in terms of social and programmatic and display-based advertising. My view actually on this though would be, the question's quite an interesting one, is it worth doing A/B testing on content for different audiences during clearing? My view would be, I would be A/B testing content for the same audiences during clearing. So highlighting what works with particular audiences. You might have 5, 10, 15, 20 audiences based on the schools that you're working with, the courses, the groupings, the demographics, the different types of learners that you're focusing on. So, I would be A/B testing content for those specific audiences. And that would be my focus, would be looking at how do you find out which content works best for that audience on a particular ad type, set, channel.
Yeah, I think the real challenge there, and to speak quite frank about that, is A/B testing is brilliant. If you want to find out what content resonates with what audience, that's absolutely fine. It's something that everyone should really do a lot of. But when it comes to clearing, it's all dependent on your plan. We talked about last minute changes. If you're going to run a clearing campaign that lasts for 2 days, what value are you really going to get out of A/B testing? What we have to think about is that end goal. The end goal is to get more students to apply, et cetera, et cetera. But when are you going to be able to implement the results from the A/B testing? The next chance is likely clearing next year. It's a completely different audience, brand new. You're a year further down the line. How much more digital savvy are you going to be in a year's time? So I think it's good to do A/B testing, but you probably need to define a longer period of time than specifically clearing, to test those. If you're going to run clearing 2, 3, 4 months in advance, great, go and test A/B content. But if you're only going to run it for a week, it's split in those audiences. It's a very, very small time frame. So as long as it's mapped out correctly as part of the strategy, then absolutely go for it. But that strategy and that time frame has to be right.
Yeah, and I think for me it's a fascinating question, and I think the point you made there, Ben, about if you're really structured and you've been really organised with your clearing, or what I'd like to call not clearing anymore, really sort of late applicants or late decision making, if you like, period. So you might start that in, say, for example, May and run it all the way through to September. Then test A/B content. The other thing I'd say is, look, for most institutions, it's expensive to create content, right? It's like, on social, you might be creating video, that's expensive. It can be often really expensive. So the thing I'd say is, yes, if you've got a really structured campaign that you're running over a longer period of time, then test A/B content. And the reason I'd say that as well is because the content that doesn't work might be a switch in content actually further down the line. So, it might, if you see, for example, one type of content performs but only marginally better than the other type of content, it might be that you can use the primary content that's got the great results and take your learnings from that. But it then might be that you can use some of that, disregarded content as your secondary content that you can use to refreshing campaigns. Because particularly on things like social, Ben, we see it a lot of the time. Ad fatigue sets in. Like if you're going with a message of we're University X, we're open for clearing, and you're running that for 4 months, the reality is people stop seeing it. Like, it stops having any impact because you hit the same people with the same message, with the same, insight over a period of time. And look, we become, we actually, it's statistically proven, our brain actually doesn't recognize that it's an offer anymore or it's anything different. It just becomes part of the course. So, that might be your opportunity that to avoid that ad fatigue that we talk about by switching content in. Again, just another little hidden tip that you might look towards. So, Ben, I think we want to now go into sort of a channel focus. I can see another questions came in around social, but my suggestion is that we pick that up when we actually sort of talk about social. So I wanted to talk about display and programmatic. So, Ben, do you want to just come in and sort of talk about the difference between, well, say what display and programmatic is first and foremost, and then say what the difference between display and programmatic is?
Yeah, so display and programmatic, we'll have all seen these ads at some point before. They can either be one of a couple of different types of advertising. So generally the two main ones that you will have prospecting and you'll have retargeting. So prospecting is that real top of funnel, tofu, awareness piece. So you may see an advertisement for a brand, a static image, a GIF, a video, something like that, for brands that you've maybe never seen before, maybe never, purchased from before or even interacted with. We then move into remarketing, where that is a brand that you've interacted with. And the way that I always describe what I do for a living is, you look for a pair of trainers or you look for something online, then it follows you around on 10 other websites afterwards. That's how I define what I do, because people then understand what that is. But that's remarketing. That's how we engage and we re-engage with users who previously interacted with us as a brand. When it comes to display and programmatic, the differences between the two are essentially the platform. So you can use Google and you can do display advertising and that kind of thing, but you can also do the exact same thing when it comes to programmatic. The difference between the two is the amount of inventory that's available. So Google, let's say, for example, runs via the Google Display Network, but not every site across the entire planet is available in the Google Display Network. It's around about 70% of all online sites are part of the Google Display Network. When you move into programmatic, the opportunity there could potentially be bigger. If you utilize one of the programmatic platforms, some of them have a 95% website inventory, which obviously is much bigger than the Google opportunity there, but it also has integrations with social as well. So you can advertise on Facebook at the same time as advertising on a display network. Microsoft can also be involved in there. There's a lot of opportunity with programmatic. If there was a bit of a caveat in there, it's that sometimes the opportunities for targeting within programmatic isn't as complex as the GDN. So the GDN may have a lot more insight into, user journeys and user buying habits and interests and that kind of thing, where some programmatic platforms simply don't have that. They have a bigger scope for inventory, but they don't have as many of those targeting options. So choosing between the two, it's a personal choice, and it's one that you probably need to define your audiences with and kind of make a choice off the back of that. But running both at the same time probably isn't the best idea. You probably want to choose one or the other. But just to go through, I guess, some real key stats with display and programmatic. So looking at display first of all, so 93% of all display-based advertising is now done via programmatic. Now that will be part of, that will include Google Display Network and that kind of thing as well. But the fact that that number is increasing every single year just shows how much value there is in programmatic and there is in that display advertising element as well. When it comes to retargeting, we know that these are a lot more specific. They're based on, or they should be based on the user and where they've previously been on the website. But 76% of retargeting ads are more likely to be clicked than a standard display ad. Now, that stat is a good one when we talk about interaction, but can be a bit confusing when you look at the real value of display. It's not to say that upper funnel display isn't valuable, because the real point of that top of funnel awareness piece is eyeballs, it's impressions, it's how many people can we get to see this ad. You may display, a top of funnel advertisement or an ad on a website, and the goal necessarily isn't to get users to the site, it's to make them aware of the brand. So if they go away and they look for a specific product, you've already kind of planted the seed a little bit. They've seen your brand, they may have never seen it before, and it then becomes part of their user choice, whereas it wasn't previously. So not necessarily all about clicks there, but those eyeballs instead. And then when we look at the converting stage, this is, I think, a really, really big one. And it doesn't necessarily just relate to display and programmatic, but 98% of users will not convert on their first visit. Now, what that says to me is when you gain a user to the site and a user navigates through the site, especially in higher education, only 1 in 50 is going to convert on the website straight away, which means that you have 49 other people who are going to move away. They're going to go and do some research. They're going to go and have a look elsewhere, which is why that retargeting element is so important. There is such big opportunity there to go after. That should be a real focus. And if you don't have retargeting as part of your strategy, you need to start thinking about it now, because there is so much opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think for me, programmatic and the ad formats actually really help you here. The reality is what are the key messages? What are the USPs you're trying to get across? And actually, some of the dynamic sort of ad formats that we can create through programmatic platforms is incredible. We see that, don't we? I mean, we work with a number of clients on this, but I'm thinking some of the creatives that we've put out for some of our big retail clients, for example, are really stand out. And we know that they're not even trying to convey a complex message. Really, they're trying to convey 30% off on bags or whatever it may or may not be. But I think in this space, it's such a visually stimulating area, where we know people engage with video content and dynamic content in a different way. And you're trying to convey, a relatively complex message is the ad format. The ad format types really allow you to put something really unique and really different together in this area. And like I've said, the reality is, the great thing when we work with higher education providers is, look, most higher education providers have a lot of this capability in-house as well. So they actually are producing some fantastic content already, whether that be things like testimonials, case studies that really jump out of the screen, some great statistics that really hit home. You've got it. So it's actually understanding how you can use the likes of the programmatic ad formats to really drive that. I think, Ben, to come in on that then, we've got a question which I'll pick up at this point, which is it more cost efficient to use programmatic or GDN, i.e. the Google Display Network?
That's a very complicated question, because I don't think there is a right or a wrong answer. Based on past experience, if we're talking about cost efficiency and we're talking about cost per clicks and that kind of thing, past experiences, the Google Display Network is cheaper. It's cheaper than programmatic. But the reason for that is you're not comparing apples with apples here. You're comparing apples with oranges. You have 70% of the market share versus potentially 95% market share. When we look at programmatic, and if there's 95% there, there's a lot more competition. And as we say, one of the stats was 93% of all display advertising spend is now done through programmatic. That's a huge portion of the market is in a programmatic platform. And, you've got, there's thousands of programmatic platforms worldwide, and they're all bidding for the same retail space, which naturally makes those kind of, the bidding strategies, and it makes the auctions a lot more expensive to be a part of. However, the data that you can get from programmatic is insane. The amount of stuff that those guys can have a look at and the amount of information that can be provided is worlds away from what Google can actually provide. If we're looking at the GDN, for example, there's limited amounts of data that we can get when we look at things like attribution. So display and attribution it's a bit of a taboo to put them together because, there's some people who have an opinion that display is all about awareness, it's not about conversion driving. And then there's others who believe that it absolutely should be be conversion driving and that kind of thing. But there's no, 100% way to map that entire process out. What you can get access to via some programmatic providers and some that we work with is that entire user journey. So it looks at variable different attribution models. So it could be something like post view. So where your ad has just been viewed and then someone has gone on to convert through another channel, regardless of what that channel is, whether it's organic, paid, affiliates, you name it, it can be part of that user journey. So you have that option. You also have things like post click, where someone has to interact with your ad specifically. They have to click on it and then go through to the website. And what you can view with some of these programmatic providers is the user journeys for each one of those attribution models, which is just something that isn't available within Google. So whilst the user might not convert on that programmatic ad specifically, you can see, the user journeys that everyone has followed. So, it's unlikely that someone is going to convert directly off a programmatic ad. The number of that's going to be pretty small. But what you want to know is the value that that's playing in every user journey, which is, easily available, readily available with a lot of programmatic providers. So that's where you're going to get real value from those.
Yeah, and I think it's about understanding as well, Ben, where it all sits within the funnel and understanding where you're using programmatic advertising. I mean, we see it, and I think it's worth talking about this point is like, to use programmatic and Google Display sort of on a last click attribution model typically isn't something we ever advise. The reality is we know that most customer journeys are multi-touch point, but when we, some of the programmatic suppliers that we work with and the platforms that we work with, when they, one of the benefits of working with, some of the big providers that we do is they'll give you that multi-channel sort of attribution sort of insight. And it's fantastic to be able to see sort of the role that programmatic adverts actually played in the conversion funnel. So people who might have searched for a term, then we're hit with a programmatic display ad because they've been on the website and abandoned, and then come back and convert through, for example, an organic search. We're able to sort of map out that full journey and understand the role that it played. And you know what? We won't ever know what would happen if it wasn't there, but we know that it does have a big impact because we see it on a day-to-day basis across the campaigns that we run. So I think that we've talked about display and programmatic. I now want to move on to, I guess, what we class as the bread and butter of more sort of paid campaigns, if you like, which would be paid search. So what we've got here is I actually wanted to share with you some, hopefully this is new insight actually for a lot of people out there. As part of being a Google Premier Partner, we get access to a range of data that other agencies frankly don't, and definitely other direct users don't get sort of access to this type of data. So what we're seeing on screen right now is sort of clicks and ad depth. So this is what Google are seeing in the marketplace right now. I'll go to clicks first. So clicks is clicks on ads shown against the search query on Google search. So that means that that's the number of ads that were clicked on when a user made a search. As you can see, sort of, it's really interesting to observe what's happened this year. We've seen sort of increases much earlier in sort of the conversion piece than in previous years, with a slight downturn round about now. Now, there's lots of ways to interpret that. I'm sure Ben and I will provide a bit of insight on that, but I think it's just worthwhile showing that the sort of the clicks are there and how that's changed, and the fact that it's not following the same pattern that we've seen in previous years as well. Ad depth then is the number of ads that are shown whenever a search showed ads. So that is essentially what we'll talk about there. Is we often use ad depth as a measure of competition in the marketplace. Like ad depth and cost per click are normally the two elements that we use to measure competition in the marketplace. So what we're seeing is that the competition's increased considerably year on year, particularly sort of over the last 2 years. It's gone up considerably. So we're seeing that more people are being more aggressive in the higher education landscape than in previous years. So that's a fascinating statistic for us. So I guess, Ben, when we talk about this, we can see that slight downturn. It's really interesting to think about how that would influence a search campaign that we would run.
Yeah, because there's loads of different factors there, really. If there's less competition, then in theory, there should be cheaper cost per clicks, cheaper CPAs, that kind of thing. But it's not always the case. I think the one key thing to pull out of there that, that really, really stands out to me is that ad depth column. So if we look at 2019, at the very start of the year, you're looking at around 2.1, 2.2 ads were shown for every single search. That's now over 4 within the space of 2 years. And if you follow that complete trend, next year is going to be 5, then 6, then 7. There's the possibility for 7 ads to be displayed on that first page. It's rare that you see 7 ads, but the opportunity is there. Google actually tested something in America, I believe it was the year before last, where they actually had every ad on the very first page was a paid ad. They tested that in the US. I don't think SEO agencies really like that, to be honest. And it made paid a lot more competitive. And since we've started to lose key metrics, things such as ad position was something that everyone used to look at. Everyone looked at ad position. They wanted to see how highly they ranked, to really try and find that sweet spot. Since that's disappeared, you have to utilize other metrics such as impression share and that kind of thing to make sure that you're keeping a fine balance there. It'll give you insight into competitors, what they're doing, how aggressive they're being in the market, and correlating that with data such as ad depth is really going to give you an insight into simply where you are in the market. Finding out where you are and deciding where you want to be is going to be key. Everyone that we speak to always says, I want to be position 1 100% of the time. Now, to be honest, you're living in a fantasy if you think that that's going to happen. It's such a competitive landscape that you have to find the sweet spot for you. We've all got targets to hit. We've all got specific numbers, and we need to do it as cost efficiently as possible. So you can be number 1. You can absolutely be number 1 100% of the time, but you could be paying thousands upon thousands to acquire a new student, which then, if you look at the entire, purchase funnel, if we call it that, that isn't profitable. Long term, that's not going to be profitable. Your institution's going to lose money. So you need to find the right spot for you, and utilizing data like this at a very early stage is really important to making sure that you find that spot.
Yeah, and look, the reality is for us is that there's sort of 2 key factors that determine rank, and determine sort of where you position. And it's essentially how much are you prepared to spend, and then quality. So there's those 2 factors that you can really focus on. Now, you can either buy your way to the top, which it gets very expensive, and as Ben says, is probably a long-term strategy. There's also, you've got to focus on ensuring that your quality score is where it needs to be at a really high level. And that's about making sure that everything from the landing pages, the keywords that are being used, etc., that, are all aligned to ensure that you're delivering the results that you need to. So from our perspective, it's a case of, biggest tips would be make sure your quality score is there, because otherwise you're going to be overpaying on your ads that you're actually getting out there. But it's also understand that there's competition there. And for me, Ben, I think this is where the things like the search query reports that we get are really crucial. It's about understanding what actually does deliver, because we see a lot of people, and it happens across brands where they'll just want to compete on a particular term. And Ben and I would be sat, if I had any hair, I'd be pulling it out, but Ben sort of pulls his hair out, and we're sat there saying things like this. Competing on that term is expensive, and it's not driving the results that you think it's driving. But there'll be, various reasons why they might just want to appear there for a particular reason, and there's another business reason, etc. But actually, if you're looking at those search query results, that'll give you an indication on what's converting, what are people actually searching for, that's yielding the results, and then devise landing pages, content that actually matches what is being searched for to drive the best results. So I think that, from my perspective, they're two of the big things that I would absolutely suggest that you focus on. I just have a question on this next slide, Ben, which is around sort of, as you can see, queries. Interestingly, again, we're starting to see a bit of a lull, going into this period. Now, just to be absolutely crystal clear, I don't know whether this is the world's opening up, so all the people who are looking for things that are actually going out and about and sort of switching off a little. I expect that to come back roaring, if I'm honest with you. And if we roll this forward, I would expect that hump to be significantly higher in sort of, than in previous years over the next sort of 2 or 3 month period. The number of impressions there, the impressions of the ad shown against search queries again. So this is around level of competition, the impressions that we're seeing in the marketplace. So again, a lot of competition, and as Ben rightly highlighted, year-on-year growth is absolutely there. It's absolutely apparent. I guess the question I had is around broad match modifier, Ben. So broad match modifier is essentially a way of a bidding approach, if you like, where we can actually target specific keywords. Or previously, we used to use it in a dynamic way where we would be able to target broad match terms around a specific term. So, for example, around a specific course. So if you were looking for, I don't know, physiotherapy degree, it would, automatically broad match would allow us to pull in multiple variants of that. Google have now, essentially brought in broad match modifier across the piece, haven't they, Ben?
Yeah, so I think with relation to what's on the screen now, I think the change that they've actually implemented with broad match modifier that I'll come on to has caused this real kind of, it looks like an anomaly. If we look at the queries from the last few years, they started off very, very closely together, and then there's been a real big dive, in 2021. But when we have a look at the disparity on the impressions, that they're miles away. There's a bigger gap there to look at in comparison to queries. And as queries drop, impressions will, systematically, they will also drop. That's part and parcel of advertising. But the real big change that Google have implemented this year is the change to broad match modifier. So broad match modifier, as of the 2nd of August, is not going to exist anymore. It's something that is going to make advertising a little bit more complicated, but should make things slightly more relevant. If anything, it's a real big testing piece, I think. But my honest opinion is the reason that we've seen queries and we've seen impressions drop, and impressions drop so dramatically, is because everyone's preparing for this change. So if we move away from broad match modifier, which allows for variations of a specific keyword or set of keywords in any order, and we move to the phrase match version, which is phrase match has been around forever, but phrase match is going to be the real dominant match type moving forward. The differences between the two are simply around keyword order. So phrase match keywords have to, the string of the keyword has to stay in the exact same order, but allows variations around it. It means that there's less flexibility when it comes to, gaining new traffic or gaining new users, because everyone reacts differently. Broad match modifier allowed us to grab everyone who just included a specific word in a search term in their search, whereas phrase match is going to allow us to do that. But when you're using multiple words within a keyword, that then becomes more complicated, because you can have those variations, but your keyword has to stay in that specific order, which means that likely impressions are going to drop off. Or alternatively, there's some big rebuild jobs that are needed there to make sure that every variation of a keyword is covered so those impressions don't drop off. And I think that's going to be a really, really big change over the next few months. Google only sent the date announcement out, I believe, this week to say that as of the 2nd of August, that's going to change. We knew it was coming, but we didn't know a specific date. So yeah, that's going to be a big change that's going to come over the next kind of 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, and I think going back to that point though, Ben, we've been sat on this call talking about how important clearing is for most institutions, the role that clearing plays. We're going to see that big change come into play just ahead of clearing. Yep. So it's really important that your organisation is aware of that, it's got a strategy to put into place for that, because there is a big difference between, single keyword ad groups, for example, that we've seen previously, or single keywords that were bid on versus broad match modifier versus phrase match. So I think that you need to have an understanding of the implications of that, and therefore sort of how you're going to adapt your strategy to ultimately meet that query that's coming in.
Exactly.
I think from our perspective as well, and I keep going back to it, it's about understanding what converts. For us, like competing on sort of more generic terms at the top, such as, best university for X or something like that, is really difficult to compete on. But we know that there's going to be really costly. Understand, I think the quick wins for me here would be understand what are those long-term sort of, phrases that people go for. What are those? Is it near me? Is it a particular location? Is it around sort of accreditation for particular courses? Really understand sort of what people are looking for and devise your ad copy to obviously engage with them and compete effectively on the ones that are driving you the best returns. I think the other one that I wanted to really highlight in here was, and I thought this would be really useful insight for people, is around in the last 4 years, cost per clicks have been in the range of $0.72 to $2.34 and peaked in August. It's hardly a surprise for us that we've seen sort of cost per clicks peak in August around that clearing date, and around that sort of late entrant piece. We've talked about it. We've gone quite aggressively on it. But interestingly here, as you can see underneath, sort of cost per clicks have gone up in that period of time because everybody gets really aggressive. But the reality is category searches have actually consistently peaked in October, which means that you're getting a lot of people doing that early research in October. So this is a piece which is around, understanding the time lags that we're seeing in the system and the way that people search for universities. For a lot of people, it's still not a quick decision. Even if they are quite happy to go in as a late applicant in August, they're still researching, they're still wanting to engage with your organisation. So this, for me, Ben, when we're talking about that AlwaysOn campaign, really plays into why AlwaysOn is really important. We know that search plays a part, by the way. So the reason that for me this is really important is understanding category searches and search queries is always important, because we know that people aren't just looking in search, but we know that search always, in 93%, search plays a part in the customer journey. So for me, it's think of the learnings that you can take into other areas of what you do here, whether that be social, whether that be programmatic, whether that's actually be in your outreach activity in terms of your engagement with colleges, feeder institutions, etc. Category searches and the number of queries that we're seeing throughout the year is massive in terms of what we do, and running those AlwaysOn campaigns has never ever been as important.
Yeah, I think this kind of really nicely maps out why that AlwaysOn, opportunity is there, and it is all the time. Even if you take the months like December, for example, which notoriously outside of retail can be a difficult or a slower month. But if you take education into perspective, what you might find here is there's a period in December, and you look how colourful January is. January is a really big month, that transition from December to January. What you might find there just is students might be going home for Christmas. They might be having those conversations with the parents about what they want to do with their life, what careers they want to take. So whilst a lot of the intent and research is done in January, that's not the discount December. Yes, it's a time that we all spend with, families and that kind of thing. So those conversations will be happening. They just aren't happening online. So you want to make sure that if there is intent there, that you're there and are ready and available for us. If there is no intent there, and quite simply, you won't have to pay for it if it's via search. It's something that there has to be intent for you to incur a cost there. So I think that really nicely displays why AlwaysOn is a good approach.
Yeah, and I think for me, the reason I want to put this on screen as well is be thinking of your own marketing budgets at this point. Be thinking about how you are going to spread that paid search strategy. As I say, we're talking about standard recruitment here. Might be postgraduate, might be undergraduate, but also be thinking about what you see from an international perspective. We haven't even touched on apprenticeship recruitment here, but apprenticeship recruitment might be 3-month campaigns. People have gone into online courses. You might, be pushing online courses every 3 or 4 months, but it's about understanding when it's expensive to do so, what you're competing against, because when we work with providers, we notice cost per clicks do vary. It's an auction. I can't believe how many times I have to go on client calls and explain that we're still in an auction. And the reality is, if there's more people bidding on a particular thing, inevitably price goes up. So be aware that it's not a flat line for cost per click, and it is something that you have to play within the parameters on. And you know what? there's certain elements that you might be willing to pay more for. And I think this is where a big part of your role comes in at Mediaworks, where we've got a head of paid strategy rather than just siloed areas, Ben, is because you're always looking at that. You're always looking at where can a client get best bang for their buck, if you like, and when's the best time to spend, where you're going to get those best high intent conversions come through.
Yeah, exactly.
So I then wanted to move on to paid social, and I think sort of I've got a question that's come in talking about a new iOS 14 update would come up as part of this, Ben. It's a favourite conversation point of ours over the last few months, I think it's fair to say. So, but I do want to go through some of the statistics that we see on screen and just highlight the case for paid social. We know that 27% of prospective teen students cited YouTube videos as a major influence in making an enrolment decision. I find that absolutely staggering. The fact that people are using YouTube in that way. We know that social's always had a big impact on product searches and product sort of research, but the fact that YouTube plays such a big part of that highlights the need for creative video across social platforms and YouTube platform as well. We know that video engagement gets 5 times more engagement than simple text and image on LinkedIn, as an example. So we know that the type of content that you produce has a major impact on the success of your campaigns. And then for me, another incredible statistic as we were pulling this forward was the way that higher education actually over-indexes for for Instagram. So most institutions now will be running Instagram campaigns, typically because of the demographic you're looking to engage with. But what we can see is that higher education-based listings typically get 3 times higher engagement on Instagram than other industries or an industry average. So that's higher than, by the way, sports, which is incredible to me, higher than entertainment. Higher education is actually the highest indexing search area in terms of engagement that people see from ads and from organic postings on LinkedIn, on Instagram. Sorry. I think for me, paid social is about that flexibility, and it sort of plays into the question that we've been asked. We've been asked around the update. Looks like it's going to have a major impact on retargeting, and therefore, would you change your approach at all? Answer: yeah. I probably would suggest that you change your approach. I think that primarily through Facebook platforms and the iOS. I think what I would say though here is the iOS 14 update, which impacts on the tracking and the opt-in aspect of it, has actually had at this stage, touch wood, slightly more minimal impact than I thought it was going to have. I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be as horrific as people made out because the world's actually 86% Android and 14% iOS is one of the statistics that I saw. But actually, I think the likes of Apple have been really clever in the way that they've actually promoted opt-in of this. So it's like, do you want more tailored advertising? Well, the answer, yeah, we want more tailored advertising. Well, opt-in. And I think that they've been really clever. And I saw that typical opt-in rates across marketing campaigns, whether that be email, through GDPR, etc., is typically around 6.5%. What we've actually seen opt out, we've only seen 14% of people opt out, is what the latest statistic from the research that's been done. And I think that, to me, would that impact the way I run campaigns? I still think we're still going to get to the majority of people and still be able to get to the majority of people through retargeting. But I think that you also have to think of other creative solutions and how we use things like event tracking and UTM tracking outside of Facebook, outside of a platform, to actually allow us to deliver sort of that impact. Ben, have you got anything that you'd love to come in?
No, you've actually stole my thunder there. You've literally covered everything I wanted to. So no, I agree. I think one of the big points was around what's that drop off going to be, and there was a lot of that fear factor that we're going to lose 95% of our audiences, and we all knew that was never going to happen. It was never going to be that big. We anticipated a drop off, but if anything, the drop off has been a lot smaller than I think certainly we expected. A lot of our clients have expected, which is good. But because of that drop-off, we know we need to be more savvy. So, as part of one of the questions there was, would we change the approach at all? Not at all. What we're working with is, the audiences, may start to decrease slightly as people start to opt out, but that just gives you the opportunity to go and test more, go and find new audiences, put a little bit of money aside for testing a brand new audience that you've never touched before. So yeah, when it comes to approach, don't think anything really changes. If anything, you can be a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more adventurous.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's really important. And look, we often use social as well as that sort of top of funnel activity. And we just talked about, for example, the ability for programmatic as a retargeting platform might be try that. We talk about test and learn all of the time. It's a big part of what we do. And I think the reality is that the opt-out rates that we're seeing right now, for me, are actually quite heartening as somebody in the digital marketing industry. I think when we first saw some of the language that was being used, I think we expected a significant amount of drop-off. But I think for me, I think it's really interesting to see that it hasn't been as bad as we first thought right now. But it's an evolving space. Look, it's something we continue to monitor and we see how it goes. But I think, going back to the point Ben made, definitely sort of test and test again, test and refine as you go through. Final question on this then came in is TikTok has to be a part of the social campaigns for target audience, ? And then what would be the average cost per impression on that channel? What I'm not going to do is say the average cost per impression. The reality here is because it depends what you're running. It depends what you're actually doing. What's the audience you're going for? How many people are you trying to go for? What terms are you actually going to focus on? What's the user group that you're actually identifying? It all has a massive impact on the cost per impression. The good thing is that actually sort of TikTok's platform now is getting much better from a marketing perspective, and it'll actually give you sort of allow you to forecast within platform as to, based on the audience that you're looking to go for, how much it will cost. So you can actually use the in-platform sort of metrics to help you with that. I think when we first looked at this sort of 18 months ago, it was nowhere near as sophisticated as what it is now. And actually TikTok's still nowhere near as advanced as some of the other platforms from an advertising perspective. But I would agree that from an awareness perspective, it goes back to our sort of test and refine. I'd be putting some budget aside to be testing platforms like TikTok to see what it does deliver and how it delivers and where it delivers in that funnel there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, TikTok was the most downloaded app for the last 2 years, probably prior to the NHS test and trace one, but it was the most downloaded app in the world. They had to build an advertising platform pretty quickly, and the fact that they've been able to develop that and build on it is quite impressive with the amount of work that they've done in the last 18 months or so. But that doesn't mean that it isn't open to its issues. But every platform has the same kind of thing. TikTok is a huge opportunity now. I mean, it's not something that I've ever downloaded, but my partner has it. She uses it and that kind of thing. There's, virtually everyone has this kind of thing now, which just creates more opportunity. You've got Facebook, you've got LinkedIn, you've got your Twitter. Now there's another opportunity, and TikTok is one of the most used apps when you look at time frame, how long someone actually spends on that app. It is one of the highest volume apps in the world. So yeah, it absolutely should be part of any marketing plan for higher education, I think.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's about how we make all of these sort of channels blend together. And I think, one of the final slides that I wanted to share with you, I appreciate we're sort of running in the time here, but is around sort of, we talk about this journey, and we often refer to sort of the customer journey and the marketing journey in a funnel. And we know that sort of for a lot of people, it's exploration. People don't go in sort of knowing specifically what they want to do. And even when they do, they can be swayed. So we know that there's triggers, there's exploration, there's evaluation, and then there's conversion. But around that, how we actually anchor that is, and this is always a bit of a preach moment for me, is make sure you're using the technology. We've just talked about TikTok. Be aware of what changes are taking place in the industry and making sure that you're on the front foot with the technology that's available. We've talked about things like broad match modifier, phrase match, etc. Be aware of the limitations in the technology and what you can and can't do. Data, I always say in higher education, it was one of the things I loved working in higher education. marketing love working with our higher education marketing clients from a marketing perspective on is they've got some great data. They've got loads of fantastic historical data, first party data. So be using that, understand what's worked in the past, sort of what timeframes, when did you get your applications, how did you convert those, what were the typical conversion periods, etc. Have a real understanding, use that data to help define not only the campaigns that you run, but the content that you run. Be creative, ensure that you're being creative, think outside the box. We've just highlighted the fact that it's more competitive than ever. So to get that cut through is going to rely on you being more creative, thinking slightly differently, not just going for this is what we did last year, so we'll roll that over. If any of your sort of agencies that you're working with are suggesting a rollover strategy, ask some serious questions, frankly. Really go in with a challenging tone, because I think that anybody, my views, running a rollover strategy from last year is frankly, ridiculous, because we're not in the same place. The market has moved. It's moved in every industry in higher education, as you've just seen in some of the search graphs that we've shown you from Google itself. Has shifted as well. There is different patterns in there. Audiences are behaving differently. So again, if you're running a rollover strategy focusing on what you did last year, it's a big no-no for me. Always be having those conversations. And then ultimately have a strategy. We started this, I think the first question was around what are the biggest issues that we see. And actually, it's probably not having a strategy. It's probably actually running lots of reactive campaigns throughout the year. Understand what you're trying to achieve, be driven by the data that you've got access to, and understand what you're actually trying to achieve, and then work back from that in terms of, I always go back to, Ben, it's why, your role here at Mediaworks is really crucial and delivers a lot of value to our clients, is around that strategic piece. It's not just diving in saying we want to do TikTok. It's not about diving in saying we want to run a paid search campaign. It's about stepping back saying, right, what are we trying to achieve? What channels are going to allow you to do that? And therefore, what are the other elements of that campaign that we need to put in place, whether that be better landing pages, whether that be better content, whether that be new assets to drive the performance. Make sure you've got a really clearly defined strategy, but don't be afraid to flex that as well and optimize as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really key point. We've got to look at all angles. Yeah, it's great saying want to do X, want to do Y, but if you sat there with peanuts to spend, you're not going to be able to do it all. So we need to look at every possible angle and work out what the best solution is for each individual institution.
Absolutely, and the best thing for me, Ben, is one of the greatest thing about our industry is look, there's choices. There's choices to match every budget. There's loads of choices out there. It's just about understanding how to best put those together.
Exactly.
So, message really from Mediaworks, as always, is own your future. It's a slogan that we use. We want you to really embrace some of the information that we've shared with you today and take that information and really move forward. So, hopefully this has been a really helpful session and given you much food for thought about how you can really drive and use paid to really drive that performance that you'll hopefully be seeing throughout this recruitment cycle and help you in planning your future recruitment activities. So thank you very much for engaging. Thanks for all the questions that have been asked. And Ben, thank you for your contribution as well. It's been much appreciated.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Start in 5, 3, 2, 1.